So when did the Old Testament end and when did the New Testament begin? Hello, my name is Jairo Torres, and in this presentation I invite you to examine what the Bible tells us about this. I begin the session by praying and asking the Holy Spirit to enlighten us in this journey. Let's remember what Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 13:12. Now I know in part. We all begin with this limited knowledge. The end of the Old Testament is described in Matthew 5 verses 17 to 19. This passage is part of a series of new teachings by Jesus. The Gospel of Matthew presents Jesus as the new Moses, the descendant of David, the Son of God, and the one who fulfills all the prophecies of the Old Testament. In Matthew 5:17, Jesus mentioned that he didn't come to abolish the law or the prophet, referring to the Old Testament, but to bring it to fulfillment. The Greek verb to fulfill, plero, is used in the sense of bring to completion, as in fulfilled prophecy. Matthew uses the same word and meaning several times in Matthew 1:22, 2:15, 2:23, 12 from 17 to 21, and 21 from 4 to 5. Matthew 5:18 begins with the causal conjunction for, which links verses 17 and 18. Verse 18 is a consequence of verse 17. In verse 18, there are two conditional clauses, to until. If the determinant condition is the first, it means that nothing, not even a letter, will change in the law until the end of the world. Heaven and earth will pass away. This would make these claims inconsistent and false, since Jesus made several changes such as the Levitical priesthood, sacrifices, the food restrictions, etc. A long list of these changes is attached at the end. Furthermore, this interpretation would render the second conditions until everything is fulfilled unnecessary and irrelevant. So let's analyze the second condition. On the other hand, if the limiting condition is the second one, until everything is accomplished, it conveys a consequence of verse 17, which is consistent and would indicate bringing to completion the law when everything has been accomplished. So the question is, what does everything mean in this verse of Matthew 5:18? Jesus already addressed this in Luke 24 from 44 to 47. From Luke 24 from 44 to 47, we ask if was the last condition on this list met? In other words, was the gospel proclaimed to all nations? The answer is yes. Mark 16:20 confirms it, and Colossians 1:23 reiterates it. Likewise, we can historically confirm this with Jesus' answer in Matthew 24:14 that the gospel will be proclaimed to all the nations before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which occurred in 70 AD. In conclusion, the second condition is the dominant and limiting one, indicating that the law of Moses is in effect until the gospel is proclaimed in all the nations, as it was done and confirmed in the Gospels. So Jesus emphasizes in verse 19 that nothing in the law can change within the context given in the previous verses, referring to the time period up to its fulfillment. Jesus reiterates this message of the transition from the old covenant to the new covenant in Luke 16:16. The great advantage of how one is justified by grace in the New Testament versus the law in the Old Testament is pointed out by Jesus in Matthew 11:11. These other passages reiterates the transition from the old covenant of the Old Testament to the new covenant of the New Testament. These passages illustrate changes in the law. More changes to the law. And more changes to the law. In conclusion, the law and the old covenant of the Old Testament ended when the gospel was proclaimed to all the nations, which occurred before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Keeping in mind our limited knowledge, as Paul expresses in 1 Corinthians 13:12, we hope to learn more details when we are in the presence of the Lord. Thank you for listening. Any comments that help us to improve our understanding are welcome. Blessings, Jairo.